March 3, 1943. Bismarck Sea, 54 nautical miles southeast of Finchhafen. Seaman First Class Takeshi Nakamura, manning the starboard 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft gun aboard the destroyer Shirayuki, squinted through his gun sight at shapes materializing on the horizon. The roar came first, low, impossibly low, the twin-engine growl reverberating across the water at mast height. Then he saw them. American B-25 Mitchell bombers, not at the 10,000 feet his commanders had drilled into him, but at 150 feet, eye level, their noses bristling with gun barrels where bombardier glass should be, 8 machine guns in each nose, coming straight at him at 280 miles per hour. His training officer at Rabaul had been clear: American bombers attacked from altitude, high-altitude formations, predictable patterns. The Shirayuki's main battery, 6 Type 3 127mm guns in 3 twin turrets, could elevate to 75 degrees to meet them. But these bombers weren't above. They were skimming the wave tops, below the depression angle of every main gun on every destroyer in the convoy. Nakamura's 25mm gun could traverse down to engage them, but the mathematics were terrifying. His gun fired 200 rounds per minute. The bomber closing on his position mounted 14.50 caliber machine guns firing 800 rounds per minute each. 11,200 rounds per minute versus his 200. The streams of orange tracer fire walking toward Shirayuki looked like horizontal rain. How had the Americans put 8 machine guns in a bomber nose? Why were they attacking at an altitude designed to kill them, flying through the densest concentration of anti-aircraft fire? Nakamura's finger tightened on the trigger as the first B-25 filled his entire field of vision. The answer, he realized in his final second, didn't matter. The dragon his bunkmate had dreamed about 10 days ago, rising from the sea, had come, not from below but from the horizon, at eye level, with 8 guns blazing. The dragon Nakamura faced had been born in an Australian depot hangar 9 months earlier, forged by grief and unauthorized engineering genius. Major Paul Irving Pappy Gunn, a 44-year-old Arkansas-born pilot with calloused hands and burning eyes, stood among the wreckage of crashed P-40s Warhawks at Port Moresby in June 1942. His wife Polly and their 4 children had been captured when the Japanese overran the Philippines in February. They were imprisoned at Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Every Japanese ship that reached its destination meant his family remained in captivity longer. Gunn was no ordinary officer, a former Navy enlisted man who'd become a civilian pilot for Philippine Airlines. He'd been pressed into service with the United States Army Air Forces when war erupted. What he lacked in formal engineering credentials, he compensated with mechanics intuition and a personal vendetta that burned hotter than aviation fuel. Standing in that junkyard of twisted aluminum and bullet-riddled fuselages, Gunn saw opportunity where others saw scrap. The P-40s were beyond repair, but their .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns were salvageable. 8 guns per wrecked fighter, and nearby sat perfectly flyable B-25C Mitchell medium bombers, twin-engine aircraft designed to carry bombs, not bristle with machine guns. The modification gun envisioned violated every North American aviation specification. B-25 Mitchells featured a glazed nose section housing the bombardier and his Norden bomb sight, the most classified piece of equipment in the American arsenal. Gunn's plan required ripping out the bombardier compartment entirely, installing a solid metal nose, and mounting 8.50 caliber machine guns where the bombardier used to sit. The recoil forces alone could tear the aircraft apart. 8 M2 Brownings firing simultaneously generated 14,000 pounds of recoil force per second. The B-25's aluminum airframe had never been stress-tested for such punishment. Without official authorization, without even informing his superiors, Gunn and his crew began the conversion. They cut away the plexiglass bombardier nose with hacksaws and welding torches. They fabricated steel mounting brackets from salvaged materials. They installed the 8 guns in 2 rows of 4, creating a devastating concentration of forward-firing power. Each .50 caliber gun was loaded with 350 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. When fired together, the 8 guns delivered 215 pounds of lead and steel per second, equivalent to the combined firepower of 7 Japanese Zero fighters firing simultaneously. The first test flight nearly ended in disaster. The pilot, Captain William Wild Bill Harris, squeezed the trigger during a practice run over the Coral Sea. The tremendous recoil pitched the B-25's nose downward so violently that Harris barely recovered before hitting the water. But the aircraft held together. The modifications worked. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, initially viewed Gunn's unauthorized project with skepticism bordering on fury. Kenney had not approved the modification. The War Department had not approved it. North American aviation certainly had not approved it. But when Kenney witnessed the devastating firepower during subsequent test flights, skepticism transformed into enthusiasm. By February 1943, Gunn had converted dozens of B-25s into flying battleships. The standard modification package included 8 nose-mounted guns, plus 4 additional .50 calibers mounted in packages on the aircraft's cheeks, plus the standard top turret, 14 forward-firing machine guns total. The ammunition load was staggering, 4,900 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition per aircraft. At maximum rate of fire, each modified B-25 could sustain 20 seconds of continuous shooting, delivering over 4,000 pounds of projectiles. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate half-inch steel plating at 500 yards, more than sufficient to punch through the hull of any destroyer or transport. What Gunn had created was unprecedented in military aviation, a medium bomber that outgunned heavy fighters and could shred surface vessels with the same efficiency as naval artillery. But overwhelming firepower meant nothing without a delivery system that could get the guns close enough to matter. Conventional bombing from altitude achieved hit rates of only 3.3% against moving ships. Gunn's gunships needed a revolutionary bombing technique to complement their revolutionary armament. That technique was already being developed by another innovator 200 miles away. A technique that would transform suicide into certainty, turning the impossible mathematics of mast height attacks into the most devastating naval defeat in Japanese history. The 8 gun noses that would terrorize Nakamura and his shipmates existed because one grief-stricken American mechanic refused to accept that standard procedures were sufficient to win his family's freedom. Firepower without precision was merely noise and fury. Major William Benn understood this fundamental truth as he watched yet another high-altitude bombing mission fail spectacularly in September 1942. His B-17 Flying Fortresses had dropped 859 bombs on Japanese shipping during September and October. 28 struck their targets. A 3.3% hit rate, 3 ships sank. The mathematics were damning. Conventional bombing doctrine wasted 97 bombs out of every 100, expending millions of dollars in ordnance and aircrew risk to achieve negligible results. The problem was physics. A 500-pound bomb dropped from 10,000 feet fell for approximately 20 seconds before impact. During that descent, wind pushed the bomb laterally. The target ship, traveling at 15 to 20 knots, moved 500 to 700 feet during the bomb's fall time. Bombardiers aimed the Norden bomb sight at where the ship would be, not where it was. Human reaction time, mechanical imprecision, and atmospheric variables compounded into consistent failure. The Japanese Navy had learned this lesson and ceased evasive maneuvering during high-altitude attacks. There was no need. The bombs missed. Anyway, Ben, commanding officer of the 63rd Bomb Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group, began experimenting with a technique he'd observed Royal Australian Air Force pilots attempting: skip bombing. The concept was elegantly simple, wickedly dangerous. Instead of dropping bombs from altitude, aircraft would approach targets at 200 to 250 feet above the ocean's surface at 240 miles per hour. At 600 feet from the target ship, the bombardier released. The bomb struck the water at a shallow angle and skipped like a flat stone across a pond, bouncing once or twice before slamming into the ship's hull at or below the waterline. The technique required 4 to 5 second delay fuses. A bomb skipping into a ship's hull needed time to penetrate the water before detonating. If the fuse detonated on surface impact, the explosion dissipated harmlessly into air. If the delay was too long, the bomb sank too deep and detonated beneath the ship without catastrophic effect. But with precise fuse timing, the bomb struck the hull, penetrated several feet underwater, and detonated against the ship's interior structure. The explosive force focused into a single point rather than dispersed across the atmosphere. The underwater blast created a shock wave that buckled steel plating, ruptured watertight compartments, and broke the ship's keel. Ben's first combat test came on October 22nd to 23rd, 1942, against Japanese warships at Rabaul. Flying a B-17 on the deck at 250 feet, he approached a destroyer at high speed, released his bomb load at 600 feet distance, and watched the weapons skip across the harbor. 2 bombs struck the destroyer amidships. The vessel exploded and sank within minutes. The hit rate wasn't perfect. Perhaps 40% of bombs struck their targets, but compared to 3.3% from altitude, the improvement was revolutionary. General George Kenney, 5th Air Force commander, immediately recognized the technique's potential, but he also recognized the B-17's limitations. 4-engine heavy bombers were less maneuverable than medium bombers. They were also more valuable. Losing a B-17 meant losing 10 trained crew members and an aircraft worth $250,000. Kenney's eyes turned to the modified B-25 Mitchell's Pappy gun had created. Twin-engine aircraft were more agile. They could absorb more battle damage and remain airborne. And with guns' 8-gun nose modifications, they could suppress anti-aircraft fire during the bombing run, solving the fatal vulnerability of skip bombing. The vulnerability was inescapable physics. Skip bombing required flying at 200 to 250 feet altitude directly toward the target ship. At that altitude, every anti-aircraft gun on the ship could depress low enough to engage. Japanese destroyers mounted 4 to 8 Type 96 25mm automatic cannons specifically designed for low-altitude defense. These weapons fired 200 to 220 rounds per minute of high-explosive shells. A skip-bombing aircraft spent 15 to 20 seconds in the kill zone, approaching at 240 miles per hour, releasing at 600 feet, continuing past the target to avoid debris. During those 20 seconds, a Japanese destroyer could fire 60 to 80 25mm rounds at point-blank range. The solution married guns modifications with Ben's technique. Modified B-25 strafers would attack first, their 8-gun noses pouring 215 pounds of ammunition per second into the destroyer's superstructure, killing anti-aircraft crews and destroying gun mounts. Seconds later, skip-bombing B-25s flying in the strafer's wake would release their bombs into targets whose defenses had been shredded. The Royal Australian Air Force added another element: Bristol bow fighter heavy fighters equipped with 420mm cannons and 6.303 machine guns would make the initial suppression run, forcing Japanese gunners to take cover. Training began in earnest in January 1943. Pilots practiced against the SS Pruth, a grounded freighter off the New Guinea coast. They learned to hold altitude precisely at 200 feet, high enough to avoid propeller wash disrupting the water surface, low enough to minimize bomb skip distance. They learned to maintain 240 miles per hour during the approach, fast enough to minimize exposure time, slow enough to maintain bomb accuracy. They learned to release at exactly 600 feet, closer risked collision with the target's mast, farther reduced hit probability. Most critically, they learned to hold course during the entire run. Evasive maneuvers spoiled aim. Skip bombing demanded flying straight through anti-aircraft fire with absolute faith in suppression tactics. By February 1943, trained crews achieved 90% hit rates during practice missions. 90%. The improvement over conventional bombing was staggering, a 27-fold increase in accuracy. The mathematics had reversed. Instead of wasting 97 bombs out of 100, skip bombing crews landed 90 hits out of 100. Combined with guns, stropher modifications, 5th Air Force possessed a weapon system that transformed suicide into certainty. Japanese convoy commanders steaming from Rabaul in early March had no knowledge of these developments. Their intelligence briefings still described American bombing doctrine as high-altitude pattern bombing, ineffective, predictable, survivable. Japanese destroyer captains drilled their crews for air defense against formations at 10,000 feet or higher, their main battery guns elevated to 75 degrees. Their doctrine emphasized maintaining course and speed during high-altitude attacks because evasive maneuvering was unnecessary when bombs missed by hundreds of yards. On March 2, 1943, when B-24 reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese convoy departing Rabaul, 5th Air Force possessed two impossible weapons Japanese doctrine couldn't counter: bombers carrying the firepower of fighter squadrons, and a bombing technique 27 times more accurate than anything in the enemy's experience. The Dragon was coming, and it flew at 200 feet with 90% certainty. February 28, 1943, Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. 8 grey transports rode at anchor in Simpson Harbor's dark waters, their holds packed with 6,900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division. The transports Kyokusei Maru, Aiyo Maru, Teo Maru, Nojima, Taimei Maru, Shinai Maru, Kembu Maru, and Oigawa Maru represented Japan's largest troop reinforcement convoy of 1943. Their destination was Lae, New Guinea, 450 miles northwest across the Bismarck Sea. Their escort was formidable: 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Masato Nakamura, veteran warships built for exactly this mission. Their fatal flaw was mathematical, invisible, and absolute. The 8 destroyers, Shirayuki, Tokitsukaze, Arashio, Asashio, Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, were Fubuki and Yugumo-class vessels displacing 2,000 tons each, capable of 35 knots, armed with 6 Type 3 127mm dual-purpose guns in 3 twin turrets. On paper, they appeared perfectly suited for convoy protection. Japanese naval architects had designed the 127mm guns to engage both surface targets and aircraft, elevating to 75 degrees for anti-aircraft fire. But a single specification buried in the technical documentation condemned every ship: the guns could not depress below 5 degrees. Against high-altitude bombers attacking from 10,000 feet, this limitation was irrelevant. Against aircraft attacking at 150 feet, below the gun depression angle, the main battery became decorative. The mathematics were cruel: 8 destroyers mounting 48 major-caliber guns, and 0 could engage targets at mast height. The destroyer's secondary armament consisted of Type 96 25mm automatic cannons, 4 to 8 per ship, depending on refit schedule. These weapons could depress to engage low-altitude targets and fired 200 to 220 rounds per minute of 25mm high-explosive shells. In theory, 32 to 64 25mm cannons across 8 destroyers provided adequate defense against low-altitude attack. The theory assumed attacking aircraft carried defensive armament typical of bombers, perhaps 2 to 4 machine guns. The theory did not account for Pappy guns, B-25 strafers carrying 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns per aircraft. A single modified B-25 delivered 11,200 rounds per minute forward, 175 to 350 times the firepower of all the 25mm guns on a single destroyer combined. When the strafer fired, it didn't suppress anti-aircraft defenses, it obliterated them. Japanese naval doctrine compounded the vulnerability. Destroyer captains trained their crews for air defense against formations at medium to high altitude. Standard procedure during air attack called for maximum speed, radical maneuvering, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. But when attacked by torpedo bombers, the primary low-altitude threat doctrine demanded turning bow toward the attackers to present the smallest possible target and bring forward gun turrets to bear. This maneuver minimized torpedo strike probability. Against strafer attack, It became suicide. A destroyer turning bow toward a B-25 strafer presented its entire length, 300 feet of target, to 14 machine guns firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. The .50 caliber rounds walked the length of the ship from stem to stern, penetrating every above-deck structure, killing every exposed crewman, destroying every piece of equipment not protected by armor plate. The convoy departed Rabaul at dawn on February 28, steaming northwest toward Vitiaz Strait. Aboard Kyokusei Maru, a soldier named Hayashi kept a diary. His entry from February 24, 4 days before departure, read, "Last night I dreamed I saw a dragon rising out of the sea." On March 2nd, his final entry, "Discovered by enemy. At night, enemy planes dropped flares and reconnoitered." The reconnaissance aircraft was a B-24 Liberator from the 43rd Bomb Group. Its crew photographed the convoy, counted the ships, estimated speed and heading, and radioed the information to Port Moresby. General George Kenney received the report at 0800 hours March 2nd. He had 24 hours to coordinate an attack involving more than 100 aircraft from 3 air forces, United States Army Air Forces, Royal Australian Air Force, and supporting elements from the United States Navy, against a moving target 300 miles from base. The weather intervened with calculated cruelty. Heavy cloud cover on March 2nd prevented large-scale strikes. Japanese convoy commanders, aware they'd been spotted, pushed forward at maximum speed. By sunset, March 2nd, they'd covered 2/3 of the distance to Leh. One more day would see them in range of land-based fighter cover. One more day would see the 6,900 troops safely ashore. They didn't have one more day. March 3rd dawned clear. Kenney launched everything, 13 Bristol Bow fighters from No. 30 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, 28 B-25 Mitchell strafers and skip bombers, 12 A-20 Havoc light bombers, 13 B-17 Flying Fortresses for medium-altitude bombing, and multiple squadrons of P-38 Lightning fighters for air cover and strafing. The attack plan was surgical. Bow fighters would suppress anti-aircraft fire with 20mm cannon fire. B-25 strafers would kill gun crews and destroy fire control equipment. Skip-bombing B-25s and A-20s would place 500-pound bombs at the waterline. B-17s would bomb from 7,000 feet to create confusion and force Japanese crews to divide their attention between altitude bands. P-38s would strafe lifeboats and survivors, controversial orders, militarily necessary, morally devastating. At 0945 hours, radar operators aboard the Japanese destroyers detected aircraft 20 miles out. Crews rushed to battle stations. Gun captains elevated their 127mm main batteries to 75 degrees. Lookouts scanned the sky for high-altitude bomber formations. The attack came from the horizon at eye level. At 1000 hours, 13 bow fighters crossed the convoy at 150 feet altitude and 330 miles per hour. Their 4 20mm cannons and 6.303 machine guns raked destroyer superstructures from beam angles. Bridge windows shattered. Fire control directors exploded. 25mm gun crews died at their positions or dove for cover. The destroyers turned bow toward the attackers, standard anti-torpedo doctrine, fatal mistake. 3 minutes later, the first wave of B-25 strafers appeared at mast height. Seaman Nakamura, manning a 25mm gun aboard Shirayuki, saw 8 gun barrels protruding from the nose of the lead aircraft. He squeezed his trigger. The B-25 opened fire at 1,000 yards. Nakamura's world dissolved into screaming metal. The mathematical impossibility Japanese doctrine couldn't survive had arrived. Main guns elevated uselessly skyward. Defensive firepower overwhelmed by offensive firepower. Tactical doctrine designed for one threat facing a completely different threat. 15 minutes remained until the convoy ceased to exist. The bow fighters came in low, so low their propeller wash left visible trails on the water's surface. 13 Bristol Bowfighter Mark 1 says, from No. 30 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, screaming across the Bismarck Sea at 330, Miles per hour and 150 feet altitude represented the opening gambit in General Kenny's combined arms assault. Each Beaufighter carried four 20mm Hispano cannons in the belly and 6.303 Browning machine guns in the wings, weapons designed to destroy German bombers over Europe, now repurposed to shred Japanese destroyer superstructures at point-blank range. Squadron leader John Jackson led the formation in a loose line-abreast approach, attacking from the beam to maximize the deck area exposed to cannon fire. At 1000 hours precisely, Jackson's Beaufighter opened fire at 1,200 yards. The 20mm cannon shells, each weighing 130 grams and traveling at 2,800 feet per second, struck Shirayuki's bridge with devastating effect. Armored glass shattered, steel plating buckled. The bridge wing where Rear Admiral Kimura stood moments before erupted in smoke and flying metal fragments. Kimura survived by diving behind the armored conning tower. His flag lieutenant did not. The psychological impact was immediate and paralyzing. Japanese destroyer crews had trained for air defense against formations at 10,000 feet. They expected bombs falling from above, giving them 20 seconds to track, aim, and fire. The Beaufighters gave them 3 seconds from visual acquisition to weapons impact. Human reaction time, the interval between seeing a threat and physically responding, averages 250 milliseconds under stress. At 330 miles per hour, a Beaufighter covered 145 feet per second. By the time a Japanese gunner's brain processed aircraft attacking and transmitted the command "open fire" to his trigger finger, the Beaufighter had already closed 36 feet and was firing. Garrett Middlebrook, co-pilot of a B-25 strafer orbiting at 3,000 feet, awaiting his attack run, watched the Beaufighter assault unfold below. He later described the ferocity of the strafing attacks, a clinical phrase that sanitized the carnage visible even from his altitude. The 20mm cannon fire walked the length of destroyer decks like a buzzsaw, cutting through everything not protected by armor plate. Sailors manning the Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft guns died at their positions or threw themselves flat on the deck. Fire control directors, the optical range-finding equipment that coordinated anti-aircraft fire, exploded under direct hits. Radio antennas snapped and fell. The whip aerials used for ship-to-ship communication toppled. Within 90 seconds of the first Beaufighter pass, the Japanese convoy's command and control structure had been degraded by an estimated 40%. The Japanese response demonstrated the fatal mismatch between doctrine and reality. Destroyer captains trained for anti-torpedo defense ordered hard turns to present their bows toward the attackers. Tokitsukaze, Arashio, and Asashio executed textbook defensive maneuvers, turning sharply to starboard to minimize their profile. Against aerial torpedoes dropped from 200 feet altitude at predictable angles, the maneuver was tactically sound. Against cannon fire from aircraft attacking at 150 feet and 330 miles per hour, it was geometrically suicidal. A destroyer turning bow toward presented 300 feet of length to the attacking aircraft. Every compartment, every gun mount, every crewman on deck exposed to a 3-second stream of 20mm fire running stem to stern. The transports fared worse. Civilian vessels pressed into military service. They carried minimal armament, typically 2 to 4 25mm guns, and perhaps a dozen rifles. Kyokusei Maru, the 5,493-ton flagship of the merchant fleet, attempted to increase speed from 10 to 15 knots, an acceleration that required 5 minutes her captain didn't have. The second Beaufighter wave caught her mid-turn, engines straining, superstructure fully exposed. The 20mm cannon shells penetrated the wheelhouse, killed the helmsman, severed control cables, and ignited the aviation gasoline stored on deck for the convoy's float planes. Black smoke began pouring from her midship section at 10:02 hours, 2 minutes into the attack. Japanese fighter cover, the convoy's supposed shield, failed catastrophically. Approximately 40 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters from the 202nd and 253rd Air Groups orbited above the convoy at 15,000 feet when the Beaufighters attacked. Japanese combat air patrol doctrine positioned fighters at altitude to intercept high-altitude bomber formations. the threat Japanese intelligence assessed as primary. When the bow fighters attacked at 150 feet, the Zeros faced a physics problem, diving 15,000 feet while maintaining enough control to engage targets moving at 330 miles per hour at wave-top height. By the time the first Zeros completed their dives, 5 to 6 minutes at combat descent rates, the bow fighters had completed their attack runs and were climbing to egress altitude. 3 minutes, 180 seconds. That was the duration of the bow fighter suppression run. In that interval, 13 aircraft firing 52 cannons and 78 machine guns delivered approximately 8,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition and 24,000 rounds of .303 ammunition into 8 destroyers and 8 transports. The anti-aircraft fire that greeted them, desultory, poorly aimed, psychologically shattered, killed 1 bow fighter, damaging 2 others. The trade was mathematically favorable. 1 Australian aircraft and 3 crew members lost in exchange for degrading the convoy's defensive capability by an estimated 40 to 60%. At 10:03 hours, Squadron Leader Jackson radioed the code phrase "Gauntlet complete" to the orbiting B-25 formations. The runway was clear. The defenses were suppressed. The kill box was open. 2,000 feet above the convoy, Captain Edward Scott, pilot of B-25D Dirty Dora from the 90th Bomb Squadron 3rd Attack Group, pushed his throttles forward and nosed over into his attack dive. Behind him, 7 more B-25 strafers followed in loose trail formation. Their 8-gun noses, dormant during the climb to altitude, were about to fulfill the promise Peppy Gunn had made in that Australian depot hangar 9 months earlier. The destroyers below, their main batteries still elevated uselessly to 75 degrees, their 25mm gun crews dead or cowering, their command structure shattered, turned their bows toward the incoming bombers. Doctrine demanded they turn toward the threat. Physics demanded their destruction. At 1,000 yards, Scott opened fire. The impossible thing Japanese naval architects had never planned for, a bomber carrying more forward firepower than a destroyer could generate in defense, began sawing Shirayuki apart with 215 pounds of lead per second. Captain Edward Scott squeezed the trigger at 1,000 yards. 8 M2 Browning machine guns mounted in the solid nose of his B-25D Dirty Dora erupted simultaneously, their combined recoil shuddering through the airframe like a continuous earthquake. The tracers, 1 round in every 5 loaded with phosphorus, drew 8 parallel orange lines from his nose to the destroyer Shirayuki's bridge. At 800 yards per second, muzzle velocity, the armor-piercing incendiary rounds crossed the distance in 1.25 seconds. The destroyer's thin steel plating, designed to resist shell fragments and small arms fire, might as well have been aluminum foil. The .50 caliber API rounds, each weighing 43 grams with a hardened steel core and incendiary compound, penetrated the destroyer's half-inch hull plating at 1,000 yards as easily as they would at 100 yards. Physics was merciless. The rounds retained 85% of their kinetic energy at 1,000 yards, 3,600 foot-pounds per projectile, more than sufficient to punch through mild steel plate, traverse interior compartments, and exit the opposite side of the ship. Scott held the trigger for a 7-second burst. In that interval, his 8 nose guns fired 933 rounds. At his current closure rate of 280 miles per hour, 411 feet per second, he covered 2,877 feet during the burst, closing from 1,000 yards to 123 yards before releasing the trigger. The stream of tracers walked the length of Shirayuki from bow to stern, 300 feet of destroyer subjected to what witnesses would later describe as a buzz saw made of molten metal. Seaman Nakamura, still gripping the handles of his starboard 25mm anti-aircraft gun, managed to fire 17 rounds before the stream of .50 caliber fire reached his position. His gun's shells, 25mm high-explosive projectiles traveling at 2,700 feet per second, detonated harmlessly in the air 400 yards from Scott's B-25. Japanese 25mm guns were optimized for fragmentation effect against lightly armored aircraft. The B-25's aluminum skin was 0.064 inches thick. sufficient to deflect fragments at distances beyond 300 yards. Nakamura needed direct hits to bring down a strafer. Scott needed only to aim in Nakamura's general direction. At 700 yards, 3.50 caliber rounds struck Nakamura's gun mount simultaneously. The first round penetrated the gun's ammunition pan, detonating 6 ready rounds. The explosion killed Nakamura instantly and wounded the 3-man crew of the port side gun mount 10 feet away. This was the impossible mathematics Japanese naval architects had never calculated. A single B-25 strafer delivered firepower equivalent to 7 A-6M0 fighters firing simultaneously, but unlike fighters, which attacked individually and broke away after seconds-long firing passes, the strafer held course for 7 to 10 seconds of continuous fire. Scott's aircraft, equipped with the 14-gun package, 8 in the nose, 4 in cheek packs, 2 in the top turret, all firing forward, delivered 11,200 rounds per minute forward. The entire destroyer Shirayuki, with 8 Type 96 25mm guns, could generate at most 1,760 rounds per minute defensive fire. The ratio was 6.4 to 1 in the attacker's favor, and Scott wasn't attacking alone. 7 more B-25 strafers followed Scott in loose trail formation, spacing themselves 12 seconds apart. A tactical interval calculated to keep each aircraft outside the blast radius of the preceding bombers' skip bombs while maintaining continuous fire on the target. Lieutenant Robert Hayes in Pawnee Princess opened fire on Shirayuki 11 seconds after Scott ceased fire. Hayes's 8-gun nose poured another 900 rounds into the destroyer's midship section, focusing on the twin 127mm gun turret elevated uselessly to 75 degrees. The .50 caliber rounds couldn't penetrate the turret's armor, 1-inch hardened steel designed to resist 127mm shell fragments, but they didn't need to. Hayes aimed at the turret's base, where the steel ring allowing the turret to rotate was exposed. After 6 seconds of concentrated fire, something inside the turret mechanism failed. The turret locked in position, unable to traverse. Its crew, trapped inside with no way to engage targets below 5 degrees depression, became spectators to their own destruction. The human cost was immediate and visible. Destroyer decks in 1943 warfare were cluttered with equipment, personnel, and flammable materials. Depth charge racks, fire hoses, life rafts, spare ammunition, signal flags, wooden deck planks, canvas covers, spare parts, all combustible or destructible. The .50 caliber incendiary rounds ignited everything they touched. A life raft burst into flames, a canvas-covered lifeboat erupted in orange fire, wooden deck planking splintered and smoked. Most devastating were the secondary explosions. A .50 caliber round penetrated a ready service ammunition locker near the aft 127mm turret on Shirayuki. The locker contained 12 127mm shells, each with 2.2 pounds of Type 91 explosive. The detonation was cataclysmic, killing everyone within 20 feet and destroying the aft fire control station. Shirayuki's ability to coordinate defensive fire, already degraded 40% by the Beaufighter attacks, collapsed entirely. The skip bombers followed precisely 8 seconds after the strafers cleared the target zone. Lieutenant James Murphy, piloting Mabel's Labels, descended from 2,000 feet to 200 feet and stabilized at 240 miles per hour. His bombardier, Second Lieutenant Thomas Chandler, acquired Shirayuki visually through his improvised bomb sight, a grease pencil mark on the plexiglass nose. At 600 feet from the target, Chandler pressed the release. 4 500-pound AN-M64A1 general-purpose bombs dropped from the internal bomb bay. Their 4-second delay fuses armed by small propellers that spun as the bombs fell. The bombs struck the water at a 12-degree angle, skipped once 200 feet from impact, and slammed into Shirayuki's hull at the waterline amidships, exactly where the earlier strafer fire had weakened structural integrity. The bombs penetrated 3 to 4 feet underwater before the fuses initiated. The underwater detonation, 2,000 pounds of Torpex explosive in 4 bombs, created a shockwave that propagated through water with devastating efficiency. Water is incompressible. The explosive force that would dissipate rapidly in air remained focused underwater, creating a pressure wave exceeding 100,000 pounds per square inch at the detonation point. Shirayuki's hull plating, already perforated by thousands of .50 caliber holes, buckled inward. 3 watertight compartments flooded simultaneously. The ship's keel, the structural spine running the length of the vessel, cracked. Shirayuki began listing to port at 10:09 hours, 9 minutes after the attack commenced. The transport Kyokusei Maru fared worse. Merchant vessels lacked the compartmentalization and damage control capabilities of warships. When Lieutenant Robert Patterson's Strafer fire ignited the aviation gasoline stored on Kyokusei Maru's deck, fuel for the convoy's Mitsubishi F-1M floatplanes used for reconnaissance. The fire spread uncontrollably. The wooden superstructure burned. The bridge crew abandoned their stations. The helmsman, wounded by strafer fire, collapsed over the wheel, locking the rudder in a hard turn to starboard. The ship circled helplessly, presenting its full broadside to successive waves of attackers. By 10:12 hours, Kyokusei Maru had absorbed hits from 6 strafers and 4 skip bombers. She was burning from bow to stern, listing 15 degrees and settling rapidly by the bow. The tactical innovation that made this carnage possible wasn't merely the 8-gun nose or the skip bombing technique. It was the combination deployed in coordinated waves. Strafers suppressed defenses for 7 to 10 seconds. Skip bombers exploited the suppression 8 seconds later. The defenders faced an impossible choice: remain at anti-aircraft positions and die from strafer fire, or abandon positions and allow skip bombers free attacks. Japanese destroyer crews, demonstrating courage that physics nonetheless negated, chose to fight. By 10:15 hours, 15 minutes into the attack, 5 transports were sinking or burning. 2 destroyers were dead in the water, and the remaining vessels were scattering in all directions, their formations broken, their defensive fire sporadic and ineffective. Captain Tamichi Hara, a Japanese destroyer captain who survived other engagements but would later learn of the Bismarck Sea disaster, captured the shock in stark language. Japan's defeat there was unbelievable. Never was there such a debacle. The impossibility wasn't that American aircraft sank Japanese ships. The impossibility was the speed and totality of the destruction. Conventional naval battles lasted hours. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted 15 minutes of actual combat, then transitioned to massacre. At 10:18 hours, 4th Wave B-25s began strafing survivors in the water and lifeboats attempting to rescue them. Controversial orders, militarily calculated, morally corrosive. Of the 6,900 troops who had boarded transports at Rabaul 5 days earlier, approximately 900 were already dead, 2,000 were in the water clinging to debris, and 4,000 remained trapped in ships that were burning or sinking. The 8-gun noses that had soared through steel now soared through lifeboats, rafts, and human beings. By sunset, only 1,200 troops would reach Leh. The 17% success rate was generous. Those 1,200 arrived without weapons, equipment, or unit cohesion. The dragon from Nakamura's nightmare had come, not from the sea but across it, flying at 280 miles per hour with 8 guns blazing. It didn't rise. It soared everything in its path into wreckage and floating corpses, and it flew at mast height because Japanese destroyer guns couldn't depress low enough to stop it. The tactical doctrine that killed the Japanese convoy didn't end with the transports. 4 destroyers, Shirayuki, Tokitsukaze, Arashio, and Asashio, committed what would be their final act by doing exactly what their training demanded: rescuing survivors from sinking ships. Japanese naval tradition, deeply rooted in Bushido code, prioritized the preservation of soldiers' lives over ship survival when the tactical situation allowed. American doctrine prioritized target destruction over humanitarian considerations. The collision between these philosophies created the final act of the massacre. At 10:20 hours, Shirayuki, already listing from skip bomb damage and burning from strafer-ignited fires, maneuvered alongside the transport Teo Maru to take aboard survivors. The destroyer's captain, Commander Noboru Shiomi, reduced speed to 5 knots and brought his vessel parallel to the sinking transport, close enough for soldiers to leap the gap between decks. The maneuver was textbook naval rescue procedure. It was also suicidal when B-25 strafers orbited 2,000 feet overhead. Waiting for exactly this opportunity, Lieutenant Arthur Bennett, piloting Pistol Pack-in Mama from the 90th Bomb Squadron, rolled into his attack dive at 10:22 hours. Shirayuki presented a stationary target, dead in the water, full broadside exposed, crew distracted by rescue operations. Bennett's 8-gun nose opened fire at 1,200 yards. The 7-second burst walked from Shirayuki's bow to stern, killing the bridge crew, destroying the forward fire control director, and detonating a ready service ammunition locker that had somehow survived the earlier attacks. The secondary explosion killed 47 men and severed the destroyer's forward power distribution cables. Shirayuki lost all electrical power. Her guns fell silent. Her pumps stopped. The flooding that had been manageable became catastrophic. The skip bombers that followed Bennett placed 3 500-pound bombs into Shirayuki's hull at the waterline. The destroyer's keel, already cracked from earlier damage, fractured completely. At 1128 hours, Shirayuki broke in half and sank in 1,200 feet of water, taking 326 of her 329 crew members with her. The 3 survivors were picked up by Yukikaze 7 hours later. Commander Shiomi died on his bridge, still attempting to coordinate rescue operations as his ship broke apart beneath him. Tokitsukaze, Arashio, and Asashio suffered identical fates throughout the afternoon of March 3rd. Each destroyer, responding to the screams of soldiers drowning in oil-fouled water, slowed to conduct rescue operations. Each became a stationary target. Each absorbed multiple strafer attacks followed by skip-bombing runs. By sunset March 3rd, all 4 destroyers had sunk. The 4 surviving destroyers, Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, abandoned rescue attempts and fled north at 35 knots. Their decks crammed with 2,734 survivors pulled from the water during brief intervals when Allied aircraft returned to base to rearm. The night of March 3rd to 4th brought no respite. United States Navy PT boats under Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins prowled the Huon Gulf, hunting cripples. At 0230 hours, March 4th, PT 143 and PT 150 encountered the transport Oigawa Maru drifting dead in the water, burning from bow to stern. Both PT boats fired Mark 8 torpedoes from 600 yards. 2 torpedoes struck amidships. Oigawa Maru sank in 12 minutes, taking an unknown number of wounded soldiers with her, the last of the 8 transports to sink. The final loss occurred at dawn March 4th. The destroyer Asashio, which had survived March 3rd with severe damage, attempted to pick up survivors from the sunken Arashio. A single B-17 from the 43rd Bomb Group spotted the destroyer at 0645 hours. One 500-pound bomb dropped from 7,000 feet, struck Asashio on the fantail, penetrated the deck, and detonated in the aft magazine. The explosion was instantaneous and total. Asashio disappeared in a fireball visible from 20 miles. No survivors were recovered. The mathematics of destruction were complete. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, 4 destroyers damaged. Of 6,900 troops embarked at Rabaul, approximately 2,890 to 3,000 were killed, died in sinking ships, drowned in oil-slicked water, or were killed by strafer fire while clinging to debris. Another 2,734 were rescued by the surviving destroyers and returned to Rabaul, but many died of wounds during the voyage. Only 1,200 troops reached Leh, 17% of the force that departed. Those who arrived came without weapons, equipment, ammunition, or unit organization. They were combat ineffective. Allied losses: 6 aircraft destroyed, 2 B-25s, 3 P-38 Lightnings, 1 bow fighter, 13 aircrew killed in action. The kill ratio was 230 to 1 in personnel, 500 to 1 if comparing only combat deaths versus aircrew losses. In financial terms, 6 aircraft worth approximately $900,000 combined destroyed 12 ships worth an estimated $60 million. The return on investment was 67-1. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet at Rabaul, assessed the defeat with brutal honesty. It is certain that the success obtained by the American Air Force in this battle dealt a fatal blow to the South Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, rarely given to understatement, called the victory one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. Both men were correct. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea ended Japanese large-scale convoy operations in the Southwest Pacific. Future reinforcements came via submarine or fast destroyer runs at night, methods that reduced troop capacity from thousands per convoy to dozens per run. Leh fell to Allied forces in September 1943, 6 months after the convoy that was supposed to save it was annihilated. The innovations that enabled the victory spread rapidly. Pappy guns' unauthorized modifications became factory standard by June 1943. North American Aviation's B-25G, B-25H, and B-25J production models featured solid noses with 8 to 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns as standard equipment. Total B-25 production reached 9,985 aircraft, with Strafer variants deployed throughout the Pacific and China-Burma-India theaters. Skip bombing became standard anti-shipping doctrine for 5th and 13th Air Forces. The combined arms coordination, suppression, strafing, skip bombing, fighter cover became the template for air-sea operations for the remainder of the Pacific War. Major Paul Pappy Gunn continued modifying aircraft and flying combat missions throughout the war. He developed forward-firing rocket systems, napalm delivery mechanisms, and additional gun packages. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, and Legion of Merit. In February 1945, United States Army forces liberated Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Gunn's wife Polly and their 4 children walked out alive after 3 years of captivity. The Dragon gun had forged from grief and unauthorized engineering had helped shorten the war that imprisoned them. Gunn died in 1957 in a plane crash in the Philippines. He was 58 years old. The wreckage of the convoy lies scattered across the floor of the Bismarck Sea. Several transport wrecks rest in 80 to 180 feet of water and have become popular dive sites, though human remains are protected under war grave protocols. The destroyer wrecks rest in deeper water, largely unexplored. Occasionally, divers recover artifacts, a ship's bell, a rifle, a soldier's helmet, physical echoes of the 15 minutes when impossible became inevitable. March 3rd is commemorated annually in Australia as Battle of the Bismarck Sea Day, honoring the combined United States-Australian operation that demonstrated what coordinated air power could achieve against naval forces. The lesson was mathematical. Precision strike at vulnerable points exceeded dispersed bombardment from altitude. Concentrated firepower that suppressed defenses enabled bombing with 90% accuracy. Innovation, velocity, field modification to factory standard in 4 months defeated doctrinal rigidity. Seaman Nakamura's final thought, as the 8-gun nose of Dirty Dora filled his gun sight, proved prophetic in ways he couldn't comprehend. The dragon from the sea had come, but not from below the waves as his bunkmate dreamed. It came across the horizon at 280 miles per hour and 150 feet altitude with 8 machine guns where a bombardier should be, guided by a grief-stricken mechanic's unauthorized modifications and a bombing technique 4 months old. The dragon didn't breathe fire. It soared through steel with 215 pounds of lead per second, held course through anti-aircraft fire because its forward firepower exceeded defensive firepower, and placed bombs at waterlines with 90% accuracy because skip bombing physics defeated high-altitude guesswork. Japanese destroyer guns, elevated to 75 degrees to meet bombers at 10,000 feet, couldn't depress below 5 degrees to engage bombers at 150 feet. The mathematical impossibility that Japanese naval architects never calculated destroyed 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and 3,000 lives in 15 minutes. It ended large-scale convoy operations in the Southwest Pacific. It accelerated the New Guinea campaign by 6 to 12 months. And it began because one American major, without authorization, put 8 machine guns in a bomber's nose and decided the standard way of doing things wasn't sufficient to free his family from captivity. The Dragon was innovation moving faster than doctrine could adapt, and it flew at mast height because that's where Japanese guns couldn't reach.